They don't make them like they used to, is the first thing that comes to mind once you start playing Tomb Raider 2. First of all, the game from 1997 leaves much to be desired in form of exposition, as you're thrown straight into a gunfight against tigers at the foot of the Great Wall of China, immediately followed by an insane amount of Indiana Jones-style spike traps and rolling boulders, before you can even begin to speculate what the story is. Because, let's face it, the writing here is terrible. Tomb Raider 2 follows the now infamous Lady Lara Croft as she searches for the mythical Dagger of Xian, which, according to legend, is said to have imbued the Emperor of ancient China with the power of the dragon when he stabbed himself in the heart with it. And if the opening cinematic is anything to judge by, it seems that the meaning is quite literal, with the Emperor stomping around on 4 legs, burning people to death with his fire breath. The thing is, none of this is explained in-game. The word Xian is never even mentioned apart from the title of one of the levels towards the end of the game. Secondly, most of the important exposition comes from such heavily accented stereotypes of what game designers in the 90s obviously thought Italian mafia members should sound like, so half the time the information is lost simply because it's hard to understand the words spoken.
With atomic on my hearing.
Though not anymore.
Nevertheless, Lara murders her way along the trail of mafiosos, led by a cultist named Marco Bartoli, from China to Venice, and then from Venice to Bartoli's Andrea Doria-inspired sunken cruise ship, and then finally to Tibet before finding the artifacts, keys and guns she needs to go back to China, unlock the Temple of Xian, and find the dagger before Bartoli does, and before he uses it to stab himself into becoming a dragon. Yeah, told you that story didn't make sense. If you struggle with the brutal opening level, you have the option of going to Croft Manor for some training beforehand, which you might honestly need, because those first levels are a bit tricky. But apart from the rapid escalation of eager trap makers under the Great Wall of China, the early levels are well paced in terms of challenge, and I remember from my childhood that being able to drive a speedboat relatively freely along the channels of Venice was such a revolutionary concept that my preteen brain was barely able to contain the excitement. None of the levels make any sort of real-world sense though. I mean, there's whole apartments solely dedicated to a single button, which in turn opens a gate in a completely different part of the city, which leads to a library where there are no entrances other than windows, and the levers to drain or flood the Venetian canals are all underwater. To put it differently, every level is designed like a maze, and the level of logical thinking, pathfinding and problem solving feels infuriating when you get stuck, because you get stuck a lot. But on the other end, it feels equivalently delicious when you eventually figure it out. I have mixed feelings around these earlier levels, however, and I'm sure that without my nostalgia goggles firmly attached to the bridge of my nose, the Venice levels would feel really dreary. It isn't really until the second half of the game, when Lara reaches a Tibetan monastery, that you really begin seeing the intricate designs of some of the best levels I have ever played in a video game. The craftsmanship, although obviously dated, really shines in terms of texturizing, decor, and atmosphere. Before the end was reached, my jaw literally dropped at the sheer scale of the massive levels towards the end, which must have been insane for the low memory computers to run back then, not to mention the PlayStation 1. The arsenal at Lara's disposal ranges from her signature dual pistols to all sorts of automatic pistols and assault rifles, shotguns, grenade launchers. A lot of the middle section of the game is spent in and underwater, so it feels natural to include a harpoon gun, but the ammunition for it is typically few and far between, and the underwater combat is definitely reminiscent of trying to do a cartwheel in a bathtub. Suffice to say, it's a bit wonky. Overall though, the combat system works really well. The aiming is completely automatic, but if you think that means that there's no skill involved, you are severely mistaken. The battles in Tomb Raider 2 are a dodge fest, and the whole idea is to run, jump, stop, drop and roll while somehow managing to remain facing the enemies so that you can pump them full of lead. Now this sometimes leads to some hilariously clumsy stumbles, but the challenge is superb and a delightful relief from Tomb Raider's contemporary reboot and other games just like it, which handles more like a glorified first-person shooter, albeit over Lara's shoulder. I would actually love for the combat style of Tomb Raider 2 to get a comeback in newer games. Now, speaking of then versus now, I'd like to point out how nice it is to not have QuickTime events. First and foremost, the set pieces involving vehicles come to mind. In addition to the aforementioned speedboat, Tomb Raider 2 lets you drive some snowmobiles through the Tibetan foothills, and there is no doubt in my mind, none, that if this game was made today, these entire levels would be a massively directed sequence where you would have to press X, triangle, and left trigger, and perhaps push the right stick down at some predetermined point for Lara to duck under logs, swerve away from gunmen, and make the jump over the chasm. Tomb Raider 2 uses none of these tricks, and although the presentation becomes anything but fluid, it makes the whole experience your experience. You fell off a cliff? Well, it was your fault for driving too close to it. The feeling of having all the obstacles, vehicles, and combat completely in your own control, and eventually mastering it without anyone holding your hand, beats anything the reboot can offer. Well, perhaps except from the story and the writing.
They want the Seraph to unlock a malignant treasure we contain in our monastery in Tibet, since being stolen by imbecile vagabonds centuries ago.
Tomb Raider 2 miserably fails the Bechdel test since Lara is the only female in the game, not counting the potential gender of animals or fish, may the rest is. The first Tomb Raider games were both praised and criticized for the hard-edged female heroine. It was definitely a revolutionary step away from the male perspective in action-oriented video games, and Lara was seen by many as a positive role model, even as a visual metaphor for sexual empowerment. But on the other hand, many felt her portrayal was objectifying and sexist. There's no doubt in my mind that Lara as an image is exploitative in nature, and that the cover image of a lady with very short shorts, sunglasses and big guns was surely the reason Tomb Raider 2 was the first this boy ever sacrificed his piggy bank savings for. But beyond all that, Lara still feels like she carries an awesome fictional personality that has lived through countless reincarnations in games and movies, and although I don't think I'll ever feel like any game featuring Lady Croft will surpass the delightful experience I've had with Tomb Raider 2, I still get really excited every time a new Tomb Raider is announced. So I never expected this, but Tomb Raider 2 has found its way into my personal top 5 games of all time, and was well worth revisiting almost 2 decades after its release. My name is Lars, and you've been watching LowBrow Gaming.